Welcome back for our third video for this summer's AP World History assignment. This video will build off content in the previous two videos, so if you have not yet watched those, I highly recommend you go back and watch those. The first video was on the historical method, and then the second was on the historical thinking skills. So if you've not yet watched those two videos, please go back, watch those, and then come back to this one. And while the last video was a little bit longer, this one I hope will be a lot less shorter because there's not as much to go over. So in this video, and it's going to be the first of two to go a little bit more in detail on this skill, we're going to go back into that skill 5 of the historical thinking skills, making connections. We're going to talk a little bit more about how do we make connections throughout the year inside this class. And again, to the next video, we'll also get into that content a little bit more as well. How do we make more connections? And in the last video, I explained that historians make connections by noticing and explaining patterns between different historical developments, processes, and even primary and secondary sources. But I didn't really go into detail exactly the process that historians use to identify these patterns, or what patterns are they looking for. And I felt like if I went into that in the last video, it would have made that video a lot longer. So I hope to make a longer video shorter by avoiding it. Historians use 3 historical reasoning processes to make connections. That's what we're going to call them, historical reasoning processes to make comparisons. And the first is to make comparison, right? The second is causation, and the last process is what we call continuity and change over time, or CCOT. And let's talk about first historical reasoning, and the first historical reasoning process that we'll examine will be comparison. So comparison is an extremely important historical reasoning process that historians use, since it really helps determine how a historical event is unique and how it's similar to other things like it, right? So it kind of helps us pick out what is special, what's important about this thing, and maybe how it's a little bit different than other things. So it's really done by describing the similarities and differences between two events or processes that we're looking at, and then maybe explaining, not just identifying. As I said, we always do a few things. We identify, so we might start by identifying or describing, but then we need to explain, why do we think that these similarities and differences exist? And then we also need to, as always, explain why it's significant, because two things can be similar. We can make a comparison between two things. We might even determine, be able to explain why they're similar and different in these ways, but it might not be significant at all. So we always need to come back to, why is it significant? In other words, why are we bothering? So describing the similarities between two events would be quite simple, but does not need to be and neither does it need to be overly complex. And so it could look something like this. The United States and Great Britain are similar in that they both have constitutions that separate the power between the 3 branches of government: the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. Each branch of government has powers the other branch of government does not have, and other branches has powers that curtail the powers of the other branches, creating what we call a check and balance. So that's how those two things are similar. So how are they different? The United States and Great Britain are different in that while they both have constitutions, the United States has a written constitution and Great Britain has an unwritten constitution. The United States elects its executive branch, which we call the president, and Great Britain inherits its executive branch, which is what we call the king or queen, or the monarchy. This is a really effective comparison between the United States and Great Britain. It describes their similarities and differences while being able to highlight how each is unique, right? What makes them unique each. Now, it's really, like I said, one thing to be able to describe or identify a similarity and difference, but we also need to be able to explain why these similarities and differences exist. So let's return to that comparison on the United States and Great Britain. An explanation as to why these two nations can be similar is that the United States Constitution is so similar to Great Britain's is that because the United States is a former colony of Great Britain, right? And that when the American Revolution happened, it was primarily concerned about preserving the colonists' rights as British citizens under the British Constitution. And so when the colonists made their own constitution in 1787, they returned to what was familiar with them, which was the British system of government. Right? So this fleshes out why does the similarities actually exist, and it explains it and even places these similarities into context. Right? All these kind of skills kind of coming together here. There could be a number of explanations as to why this similarity can exist. And so the one I just gave you about the United States and Great Britain does not need to be the authoritative one, although it is a common one. It is a debatable thing. All right, an explanation for the differences between the two countries could be that they are different because the United States adopted a written constitution due to its tradition of colonial charters granted to the 13 colonies by the King of Britain, which were paper documents that always outlined the colonists' rights. It was these charters that the colonists were defending in the 1760s and 70s. Britain had maintained an unwritten constitution due to its long history of negotiating power away from the king, creating a variety of documents over time that created precedent. Americans never adopted a monarchy since they had no established nobility, unlike Great Britain that had a nobility since the fall of the Roman Empire. Again, this explanation kind of fleshes out the similarities and differences that we have noted, and it could be a different explanation for anyone as long as they reason it out. Now, I've described the similarities or identified the similarities between the United States and Great Britain. I've even explained why I think they exist, but our last question, the significance, or in other words, why does this even matter? And you always need to be able to explain why a comparison is significant, because not every comparison, like I said, is significant. So, for the comparison between the United States and Great Britain, for the last time, it can be a significant comparison since it illustrates the British Constitution being replicated in the United States has created a framework for democratic societies that have been emulated around the world due to its effectiveness in creating stable societies and preserving the freedoms of its inhabitants. It's a really basic explanation of significance, but it's how we make a complex argument, which you'll need to be able to do throughout the year. So comparison is an important historical reasoning process. Since, again, it helps us kind of determine what is unique, what isn't unique, and it also allows us to have a greater and growing appreciation for how maybe different cultures have developed over time. However, this is only one of the 3 historical reasoning processes that historians use to identify those patterns. So the next one we're going to talk about is causation. With causation, we're determining a cause and effect relationship. So essentially, what causes a historical development or process to take place, and then what is the effect of that historical process and event once it has taken place, right? With any examination of causation, we should be looking at kind of 5 separate things. We should be able to describe or identify the causes and the effects of the historical development process. Then we should not only just be able to identify, hopefully you're starting to get a pattern here, but we should also be able to explain the relationship between the cause and effect of the historical development. And then we should be able to explain the difference between primary and secondary causes and short-term and long-term effects, and explain any relevant context to a specific historical development. And finally, we should always be able to tell why is this significant of this cause and effect relationship that exists. So to demonstrate these 5 principles in action, I'm going to use the Agricultural Revolution, which was an event that took place thousands of years ago, and it's when man shifted from hunting and gathering to agriculture, or began to farm. Right? So, like comparison, we should start with describing the cause and effect of a historical development, and that is pretty straightforward. We're just going to identify what is the causes, what are the effects. So again, with the Agricultural Revolution, what are the causes of the Agricultural Revolution? Well, there's a massive change in the environment or the climate at the time. The Ice Age had come to an end across the world, and that led to the growth of what we call wild grains, which would eventually become wheat, corn, barley, things like that. And the development of those plants were developed by humans, which led to an increase in populations. And as those populations increased, because of the increased amount of resources after the Ice Age, it led to an increased demand in food. And so, that's what caused the the Agricultural Revolution. Is you have the Ice Age come to an end, more need for food. Or more food present, leading to a growth of populations, which then created a demand for food. The didn't really exist beforehand, and so that caused the agricultural revolution to take place. What the agricultural revolution, the effect of the agricultural revolution is it led to the growth of cities and the division of labor, right? And division of labor is just farmers, craftsmen, priests, kings, soldiers, policemen, all of that comes out of the division of labor. And so what I've done here is just simply identified the causes and the effects of the agricultural revolution, which means I now need to be able to explain why I think these are the case. So it's important to make a connection between the cause and effects of a historical event and then how they connect together, right? So the agricultural revolution's relationship between cause and effect is what we're going to talk about first here. So again, the increase in population created demand for food, and that led to the creation of agriculture. And that led to the continued increase in population and meant that not everybody in society needed to dedicate their time to gathering or hunting for food and could now focus on other things like being a soldier, priest, carpenter, or a king, right? So that kind of gave us a little bit more flesh, but maybe we need some more explanation. And so most events, when we are talking about them in history, have what we call primary and secondary causes, and also short and long-term effects. And that kind of gives our causation some complexity there. So what are primary and secondary sources? I want to give you the example of like rolling a ball down a hill. The primary cause of rolling that ball down the hill is the person who pushes it down the hill, right? But the secondary cause is the gravity that pulls the ball down the hill once it's pushed, and that creates the momentum that builds up as it moves down the hill, right? So when we're talking about the agricultural revolution, the primary cause would be the climate change, right? That's the initial pushing event. And the secondary cause would be the increase in population, creating a demand for the food. So some short-term effects and long-term effects. So what are we talking about when we're talking about those? Short-term effects are essentially just effects that occur immediately after the event occurs, and they might only occur for a temporary amount of time. Long-term effects either appear after slow or continual process long after the event started and is sustained. It might even be continually going on to this day, right? So it's usually a permanent change that comes out, or a permanent effect that comes out of it. So when we're talking about short-term effects of the agricultural revolution, well, the short-term one was it created worse health outcomes for the first farmers that ever existed, right? They were physically shorter than hunter-gatherers because they had less access to protein. They got sick more frequently than hunters and gatherers. They died at an earlier age than hunters and gatherers. Really bad health outcomes as a short-term effect of the agricultural revolution. But the long-term effect of the agricultural revolution is it allowed for the creation of civilization, right? It created gender roles, the creation of culture, the creation of government, right? So those are things that are definitely impacting us to this day. And again, whenever we're looking at a causation, we should also be looking to put it into context, because everything's happening in context, the cause and the effect. So I won't dive back into detail again on context because we talked about it in the last video, but just keep in mind that context is just what is some background information or events that are going on around a process that is occurring that might broaden our understanding of the event. So for the agricultural revolution, some really important context to keep in mind is that most people remained initially when the revolution took place nomadic hunter-gatherers. They did not all immediately adopt agriculture. Agriculture was really only adopted in areas where resources were scarce, right? Where it's difficult to continue to do hunting and gathering without starving to death, right? And lastly, still ongoing, since man is still working to improve farming methods to increase farming yields, right? And lastly, we should always be able to articulate what is the significance of this event, right? Of this causation that has taken place, right? Really simple for the agricultural revolution. Without the agricultural revolution, many of the civilizations that we are going to study in this class would never have existed. We are going to look almost exclusively at agricultural societies, right? A simple explanation, but sufficient enough that really gets us to talking about why the agricultural revolution is significant. Just simply put, we would not be here without the agricultural revolution. So being able to identify and explain causation is incredibly important. Since no events exist in a vacuum, with nothing that caused it and it having no effect later on anything else. So this gets us to the last historical reasoning process, and that one is continuity and change over time. This is the last of the three historical reasoning processes, and it should be something that we're constantly looking to identify throughout the year, because we're going to look at different regions over different times periods. We should be able to identify these things. And so we'll call this CCOT. I might mention it in class as CCOT, but it just means change or continuity and change over time. That's all it means. What is a continuity? Continuities are things that stay the same over time. Right? Just stays the same. And changes are things that change over time. Right, obviously. And so throughout the year, you'll be asked to identify what stayed the same and changed over a given time period, like 1200 to 1750. They'll say, hey, what stayed the same in China from 1200 to 1750? What changed in China between the period of 1200 to 1750? So this really can be easily done by just looking at your own lives if you're trying to visualize what do I mean by change in continuity over time. And so let me give you my change in continuity over time in my own life. My continuity would be my interest in history, but my change would be maybe my engagement or interest with history. So when I was a kid, I mostly just engaged with history as a curiosity, right? I might pick up a history book from time to time, might read through it. I was interested in it, but I wasn't looking for anything deeper other than just learn. And when I got into high school, my interest started to change a little bit more. I became more involved in history. I took up Civil War reenacting, which is where I met my wife, which was, pretty amateur interest, but it was a little bit more involved. And then now I'm working towards a PhD in history as an academic pursuit, right? So now I'm writing, right? That's my interaction and interest in history. If I were to explain, again, we should always be able to explain why this change occurred. I think it had a lot to do with the time that I had in college and the professors I had that instilled a more academic interest in history rather than just a passing or more amateur interest in history. This is a significant change, since if my interest never grew, I wouldn't even probably be teaching history, right? So we should be aware of continuity and change over time in any development or process that we're looking at throughout the year, which is why it's really important that we kind of hammer this one in with the content as we discuss and engage with it. All right, these are our three. Like I said, these are our three historical reasoning processes. They're really critical for helping you make connections with the material throughout the year, right? Likely the book you picked out for the summer is engaging with these processes in some way, pointing out how one event caused another and the effect that that event is having. The historian is also probably pointing out how the event is similar to other events that might have been going on at the time, and is probably identifying what makes them different. And lastly, they might also be acknowledging how the event is really a continuity within history, or how the event has changed that continuity. So these are simply put reasoning processes that you could even use in your daily life. They're not just for history. We should always wonder when somebody makes a claim that if something is brand new, if it truly is brand new, right? So in the next video, we're going to look at the themes of world history, how they're going to shape how we approach the content this year in the class, and then what type of things will we be discussing this year. Thank you again for watching through this video. If you have any questions, please reach out to me, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.